Hello, Professor in class. This is Giovanni. For today's presentation, I will review the City of Pasadena's most recent capital improvement plan and highlight one of the capital improvement projects listed in that plan. I will provide an assessment of the primary types of long-term debt that Pasadena might be able to use for the capital project, along with the advantages and disadvantages. The development of a capital improvement plan is a collaborative effort between the Pasadena Department of Public Works, the City Council, and Commission members who are comprised of residents and city employees. Now, for a project to qualify for inclusion in the capital improvement plan, it must meet the following criteria. The cost must be at least $75,000, address a particular safety issue, and existing maintenance efforts are no longer sufficient to keep the facility in good repair, and the existing facility is no longer adequate to meet demand. Pasadena's most recent capital improvement plan covers fiscal year 2026 through 2030 and outlines a total estimate cost of $2,485,067,250 in capital projects across the 5-year period. From this amount, $895,791,430 represents existing appropriations carried forward from fiscal year 2025 for ongoing projects. For fiscal year 2026, the Pasadena City Council adopted $446,087,631 in new capital improvements plan funding. For the remaining fiscal years of 2027 through 2030, the proposed funding levels will be finalized in future budget cycles as the City Council votes annually on the approval of budgets, which include capital improvement plans. Most of the capital improvement plan funding is allocated to municipal buildings and facilities, which is where I will be looking in depth for today's presentation. The biggest project in the municipal buildings and facilities is for the Central Library. The capital improvement plan included approval for a seismic retrofit and renovations for a central library with an estimated cost of $204,860,000 for fiscal year 2026. $195,860,000 has been adapted, and this funding is covered by Measure PL. Now, Measure PL is not a ballot measure, but rather an internal capital improvements plan code for the library parcel tax, previously known as Measure L. This was a voter-approved tax passed in November 2022, providing dedicated revenue for Pasadena library operations and capital needs over the next 15 years. Now, for the remaining fiscal years, Pasadena does have options. Pasadena has two primary options to raise revenue for its central library projects. The first is to generate funding immediately using existing taxes, charges, grants, or other current revenue sources. This approach is known as pay-as-you-go. The second option is to borrow funds now and commit to repaying the debt over time using future revenues, which is commonly referred to as pay-as-you-use system. Pasadena is currently using the pay-as-you-go method with Measure L. Remember, Measure L is a parcel tax that produces annual revenue each year. As such, Pasadena can directly fund library improvements, including capital projects such as the Central Library seismic retrofit. Such funds provide a way to use the pay-as-you-go method for its long-term debt. However, the cons are concerning. The actual dollar amount is not guaranteed, as revenue is dependent on taxes, which are tied to the economy. During economic hardship, the amount of revenue collected by taxes tends to dwindle. Additionally, political interests and other priorities may interfere with the approval of Measure L funds for retrofitting the Central Library. Each fiscal year, the City Council will input from citizens decide how much funding to allocate to any project and by which means to pay for it. If a city council member has other priorities that they feel their constituents prioritize, they might not approve Measure O funds for the Central Library's seismic retrofit. As such, borrowing might be a better option. One way the city may raise revenue is by issuing a general obligation bond. These are known as full faith and credit bonds because the city pledges to repay the debt, including interest, by using the full power of its taxing authority. In other words, the city provides an unconditional guarantee of repayment, even if that requires raising taxes to meet its obligations. The advantages of these bonds include lower borrowing costs, as general obligation bonds typically carry lower interest rates due to their guarantee of repayment. They also enhance the city's credit worthiness, as investors have confidence that they will be repaid regardless of economic conditions. However, the disadvantages are prevalent. Because general obligation bonds offer lower interest rates, they may be less attractive to some investors, as the return value is not high. Additionally, the city assumes long-term repayment obligations, which means future fiscal years must allocate resources to cover the debt. Another significant disadvantage is that general obligation bonds require voter approval, which can slow down or block a project. Since repayment often requires an increase in taxes, voters may be reluctant to support such bonds, especially during periods of economic hardship. Now, another option is to issue revenue bonds. These types of bonds are repaid from a specific revenue source, not from general taxes. Since these bonds are not paid by general taxes, voter approval is not needed. The advantages of revenue bonds are that they are faster to issue, since voter approval is typically not needed, do not directly influence general tax revenue, and as such, the financial burden falls on the user and not the taxpayers. The disadvantages are that they cost the city more money, since they have a higher interest rate. The return on investment is uncertain for investors, as repayment is based on a successful revenue stream. Furthermore, if a project funded by this bond fails, it will harm the city's credit rating. However, it will be very difficult to use a revenue bond for a project such as the seismic retrofit of the central library, since the amount of revenue a library generates will likely be insufficient to repay this type of long-term debt. With that, this brings my presentation to a close. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. Can't wait to see your presentations. God bless.